How are humans making it worse? Welcome back to AP Environmental Science. This is going to be video for 9.4. We're going to talk about increases in the greenhouse gases. How are humans making things worse? Well, let's start right off the bat with anthropogenic sources of greenhouse gases. Remember, anthropogenic meaning human-caused, human-sourced, whatever you want to think about. Whenever you see anthro, you're talking about humans. Fossil fuels are a huge part of increasing the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We release CO2, we release methane, we release nitrous oxide. We also release particulate matter, which lowers the albedo. So essentially, when we release all of the particulates, like black soot, they're going to eventually rest somewhere. And what we hope is that they don't rest on, say, I don't know, snow, because snow has a great albedo effect, which reflects light. That's what albedo is. It reflects light. And when the black soot rests on the snow, it blocks some of that reflection, which allows the snow in that area and the ground underneath it to absorb more heat. That's not good. There's one cause from humans. Another one is agriculture. When we over-irrigate, when there's too much water, it prevents the amount of oxygen that those areas can get. So without, having access to the atmosphere to get the oxygen, you're going to get an anaerobic process, and that ends up releasing methane. We also have fertilizers, which encourage the denitrification, releasing more nitrous oxide into the atmosphere, and cattle and sheep release a wonderful, nice amount of methane emissions because they, are eating and digesting and converting and farting. Cow farts, right? Isn't that what people always say? But don't worry, we are also part of that. Humans release about 0.12 kilograms of methane per year. Now, that's not too bad when we look at a cow, like Western cattle, the stuff that we raise, beef. 120 kilograms per year of methane into the atmosphere. But I do always like this one because 0.12 kilograms of methane, you're farting 0.12 kilograms every year of methane into the atmosphere. It's disgusting. Just get a hold of yourself. Obviously, if we have more of any of these numbers, that's going to persist and become more of a problem. Deforestation is also a huge part of what increases global greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, because with less photosynthesis, there's more carbon dioxide. And then when they use clear cutting and burning, that will release particulate matter, methane, and nitrous oxide too. So deforestation is a huge part of where we get increases in greenhouse gases. Another one is landfills. So we talked about this in the last unit where we talked about sanitary landfills and how landfills kind of work. But the important thing here is that methane can be released from landfills. So what happens? Well, the landfill has food scraps, garden waste. These are things that create acids in anaerobic conditions and pollute the groundwater. That's why we put clay underneath, right? Leachate then can soak into the surrounding ground, and that's what contaminates the groundwater. So if we don't have a clay and plastic layer on the bottom, we're going to get this leachate. Unfortunately, a sanitary landfill might succeed in preventing the leachate from getting into the water and polluting the groundwater and the ground in general. Methane is produced from this anaerobic process that occurs. Now, and I'm not joking about this, there are some landfills that are able to capture that methane and essentially store it and use it for its own sources. There is a company that works out at Lockwood, which is our local landfill. The company is working on research on how to convert municipal waste into jet fuel, which is really cool. But you can imagine, this is just methane. It's natural gas. It's a fuel. They use compactors to compact this stuff down because, you obviously want to put more and more garbage into the landfill, but those compactors remove the air, which makes it even more anaerobic. So realistically, if we were to do landfills right, we would want to leave them fairly oxygenated so that the processes do not create as much methane. We are still going to see carbon dioxide produced, though. Of course, we talked about CFCs being that number 6 on the list, right? So HCFCs, which have replaced CFCs, they're also greenhouse gases, okay? Now, HCFCs might be a little bit better because they don't create the huge problems in ozone reduction, but they're still not great. So CFCs are now banned, and HCFCs are slowly being phased out as part of the Montreal Protocol. This is where all of these processes occurred. The goal, of course, being that 100% reduction by, now. You should look into that, see if we actually are there, because I don't think we are. We might be, though. All right. So human sources of methane, just a reminder, human sources of methane can come from fossil fuel production. That's the biggest group right here. The second biggest is livestock farming, then landfills and waste, biomass burning, rice agriculture, and then biofuels, very small amount. So fossil fuels, livestock, and landfills are 80% of the methane released into the atmosphere from humans. So maybe we could think about things to fix these three things. That's why we focus so much on fossil fuels, livestock, and landfills. We talked about livestock a lot in land and water use unit, Unit 5. Landfills last unit, Unit 8, and fossil fuels way back in Unit 6. So if we could reduce these numbers, we're going to make the biggest reductions in our methane production. Nitrous oxide comes from other sources. Agricultural soil management produces 79%. 79%. Okay? Stationary combustion, aka fossil fuels. Industry or chemical production, also kind of fossil fuels. Transportation, also fossil fuels. Manure management, good old-fashioned just manure management, right? Creating compost, making sure that we have good manures. But if you look, fertilizers and agricultural soil and fossil fuels contribute to 95% of the nitrous oxides. Again, we focused a lot on this stuff right here, sustainable agriculture, and this throughout this course. That's why we do, because they have such an impact, not only on those impacts that we talked about, but they also have impacts on greenhouse effect. So fossil fuel combustion is the biggest reason of our carbon dioxide problem, right? We can look at this graph and we can say, okay, transportation, 42%. If we can fix transportation, we're going to produce way less CO2 into the atmosphere. And that's why you see a lot of motion or movement towards like, hey, what if we had electric cars? The reason for that is very simple, because that is the largest contributor to CO2. But we can't just tackle one. Industrial is another big one, right? 23% of the carbon dioxide released in 2014 came from industrial sources. Electricity generation, 14% electricity generation that's imported. So this is stuff that we get in state. This is stuff that comes from imports. Then agriculture, residential, and commercial. These are not huge, right? When we're looking at how do we make a difference, we need to tackle transportation, industry, and electricity generation. And electricity generation comes into these residential and commercial as well. Fossil fuel combustion, 95% of the CO2. So if we can get rid of fossil fuels, CO2 becomes way less of a problem for us. All right, so let's talk about this wonderful, wonderful thing. We're going to talk about all of these causes and effects, okay? When we have an excess amount of greenhouse gases, that causes climate change, okay? Now, this climate change can cause rising sea levels. There's one problem. We'll talk about it. That comes from melting ice sheets and thermal expansion. Water, as it gets warmer, is going to get bigger, which means, it's going to expand. That's part of the sea level rise. Also, just ice being released into the ocean. That's going to cause sea level rise. On the other side, we see a spread of disease vectors, right? More diseases being spread and transmitted. This causes changes in population dynamics and population movement. This stuff right here is all going to affect us wonderful humans, okay? So thermal expansion, disease vectors, rising sea levels, population movements. This is going to cause people to move to new areas. Sea levels also going to have this happen, right? People are going to move. People are going to immigrate or emigrate depending on where the problem is, right? And this is going to cause mass hysteria. So that's going to be the end of our greenhouse gases talk. Our next video, we'll talk about global climate change. Where's all this coming from?